With that being said, we're going to go ahead and hear the preaching of God's word now. And so our scripture verse is going to be read by one of our members. Please give your attention to the screen as God's holy word is read to us.
Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. I said in my heart with regard to the children of man, that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beasts, for all is vanity. All go to one place, all are from the dust, and to dust all return. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him?
Well, may God bless the reading and the preaching of his word. Again, if you're new, just tuning in, we would love to be able to connect with you and see if there's any way we can serve you. You can go ahead and text the number that's coming up, new to CC, 9400. We'd love to be able to connect with you more. Also, want to let you know, there's going to be a live Q&A after this service. So once we get done here, just hold on where you're at. And if you're on Facebook, just keep hitting refresh. And I'll be doing a live video where you can put questions in the comments, and I'll answer them. If you're watching this on YouTube or our church website, there's a link in the description. And you just go ahead and click that link after the service is done. It'll take you over to the live Q&A. And again, there might be a little bit of a lag. Just keep hitting refresh. I promise that it'll work. We did it last week, and it was a blast. So looking forward to having that time to connect together afterwards. We're going through a book of the Bible called Ecclesiastes. And Ecclesiastes is kind of like Legos. We're doing a lot of Legos in my house these days. Kids, raise your hand. Anyone doing Legos? I can't see your hands raised, but it's fun to still raise your hand. That's good. Ecclesiastes is kind of like Legos, except backwards. Like with Legos, you start with a bunch of pieces, right? And you put the pieces together until you get a nice, creation. This creation was made by my son. He can explain to me afterwards what it is. But that's what we start with, right? Well, Ecclesiastes is this backwards. It starts with a nice creation, and then it just starts taking all the pieces apart. It takes all the pieces apart. This nice, clean, easy life, this thing that you thought you had it all figured out and all together, it's actually just a big mess of puzzle pieces. And Ecclesiastes just it points out all these puzzle pieces to us. It points out all these broken Legos and says, look, life is a mess. But it points that out so that we can start to build it back even stronger than before. Ecclesiastes doesn't want to go through life kind of faking it. Ecclesiastes wants us to go through life, seeing life in the brokenness for what it is, and knowing how to be built back stronger and not defeated by it. And so here's how this passage that we just read, here's how it kind of breaks things down. I want to show how it breaks things down, and I want to show you how it builds us back even stronger than before. Here's what it does. It asks a question. It asks a question that really demands the answer. And I would sum up the question this way. It's also the title of today's sermon. The question is this: life's not fair, so now what? Life's not fair, so now what? And I want to go through this text in kind of three parts as we look at this question. I want to see the question of justice in this life. Let's look at the question of justice in this life. Then let's look at the evidence for an afterlife. Let's look at the evidence for an afterlife. And then let's see what this means for us today. And so part one, the question of justice in this life. Verse 16 describes a really tragic picture. the author, he looks around and he sees just so much wickedness taking place. But what makes it even worse is not only is there all these bad things happening, this injustice occurring, but the people who are doing this injustice are those who are supposed to be upholding justice. It's not just that what is happening, it's who is doing it that's really getting to him. It's like he's going to the cops to complain about gang violence, only to find out that it's the cops who are running the gangs. Right? He says, in the place of justice, there was wickedness. We've seen this in some really sad ways recently, haven't we? I mean, on the one hand, it's just been amazing to see the incredible things that our country has done to pull together. I mean, people stepping up and giving just heroic efforts. Like, I love the amazing stories that are happening. We have an incredible country. But it's also been heartbreaking to see some of the corruption and profiteering that's taking place. And so I think about how, you had those small business loans that came out that were supposed to go to small businesses that got snatched up by big corporations that really didn't need the help. You may have remember reading news articles or may have heard about the news articles about there were some politicians who knew what this was going to happen. They've been talking about this. They've been sitting on the security councils, and instead of getting our country ready to prepare for this, what they did is they shorted some stocks on Wall Street and got really rich. There have been people who have hoarded vital and essential supplies so that they could charge exorbitant prices for them. You can find a million different kinds of scams being run right now on the internet for so-called cures. The stories come in about people being robbed of their stimulus checks and defrauded as they're trying to make ends meet, and what they were looking to as a lifeline is snatched out of their grasp. I was reading a news article this week about just how sad it is to know that there's some nursing homes where they're already a vulnerable population and they've been made even more vulnerable through neglect and abuse that's taking place. Like, there are definitely great stories happening, but there's also stories that honestly hit you like a gut punch. And so this author, he's seeing this. He's seeing that where there's supposed to be justice, there's actually injustice. And he tries to comfort himself in verse 17, but by saying that, well, maybe God's going to judge things at the right time. But notice, it says in verse 17 that he says this in his heart. Right? That phrase basically means that he's talking to himself. He's not speaking with certainty. It's just something that he hopes for. But then he starts to talk to himself some more and says some other things to himself. And this is what he says in verse 18. He said in my heart with regard to the children of man that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. He's like, well, maybe God isn't going to bring this justice that I'm hoping for. Maybe God's just testing us. And that word testing there doesn't mean testing like trying to pass a test. It means testing like how you test a rock to see the minerals that it's made up of. It's testing to show something. He's like, maybe God's trying to show us something through all this. Maybe he's trying to show us that we're no different or no better than animals. He begins to think this out a bit more in verse 19, right, where he said, what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beast is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. He's like, maybe we're no different than animals. We all die just the same. And since he's been talking about injustice, we need to follow his train of thought here. This isn't just like, random stream of consciousness. No. He's saying the reason maybe that there's all this injustice in the world is perhaps because we're all just a bunch of animals. Like that's the link that he's making here. In the animal kingdom, there's no sense of justice, right? It's just might makes right. Any of you kids see Finding Nemo? You can go ahead and raise your hands again. And again, I can't see you, but it's still fun to raise our hands, isn't it? All right. Well, you remember in that movie that you had the sharks, and they made that like humane society for the good treatment of bait fish, Well, that's funny. Why is that funny? Well, because in real life, sharks only eat bait fish. Like, they don't care about their treatment. They just care about their dinner, In the wild, a lion doesn't sit there and when it sees an antelope, consider what the antelope is going through. Like, the lion doesn't think, oh, what, I bet you that antelope, they probably have a bunch of mouths to feed. I'm just going to let that one go by. No, he sees an antelope and he's like, hey, put the steaks on the Barbie. It's chow time, right? Like there is no sense of any kind of justice or equity in the animal world. It's just, I'm going to do what instinctually feels right, and unless you can stop me by having greater might, it's going to happen. The animal world is ruled by might makes right. And that the author's wondering, maybe that's what we're seeing here. Maybe the reason that there is all this injustice taking place in places of justice is because we're actually just all animals in the end. He says this again in verses 20 through 22. He says, all go to one place. All are from the dust, and to dust all return. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes down to the earth? So I saw that there's nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? He's saying, he's like, hey, we all die and the same thing happens to us. We all just go back to the dust. Like, how can we really know that something different's going to happen? How can we really know what comes after that happens? He's like, we can't. And so I better stop thinking about it and just try to find pleasure in what I'm doing right now. It makes me think of a quote from one of the great legal minds in our history, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. He says, as he's thinking about this, he says, there's no reason for attributing to man a significance different in kind from that which belongs to a baboon. Right? He's saying the same thing here, saying we're all animals. And then watch. I can't think about that, though, and so I go downstairs and play solitaire. He's like, I'm probably just an animal, but I can't think about that, so I'm just going to distract myself from that reality. See, this author of Ecclesiastes, he had started by trying to find comfort that God's going to bring justice, but the more he spoke to himself, the more he thought, well, maybe I'm just an animal, and maybe there is no afterlife, and consequently, no God at all. Right? Maybe that's the reason there's no justice. Maybe that's why life is so unfair. See, he's breaking down the pieces. He's breaking down the pieces. But he's faced with a dilemma here. He's faced with a dilemma. And this is the dilemma that kind of comes in chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. He says, again, I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun. And behold, the tears of the oppressed. And they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors, there was power. And there was no one to comfort them. Do you see what he's saying there? He's saying, man, if there's no God, if we're just animals and there is no afterlife, there's no eternity, there is no God, then there is no promise of justice. There is no comfort for those who are oppressed. Like their tears are just going to go unanswered. Maybe if all there is might makes right, then for some people, life is never going to be right. And so here's his dilemma. He's saying, I can't know for certain there's a God, because all I see is just this evidence that we're animals, and a God of justice could never allow a life like this. But if there is no God, then there is no ultimate justice, and so there's no hope for comfort for those who are oppressed. If that's true, then it's like, the famous poem Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, who said, life is just nasty, brutish, and short. So he's caught in this dilemma. He's saying, I can't believe in God if there's so much injustice, but I can't not believe in God or there's no hope for justice. He's really asking this question. Life's not fair, so now what? Like, what do I do with that? He's pointing out the broken Lego pieces of life. And listen, we need to understand this. Life will either break you down and you will not be prepared, or you can break down life and think about each piece and know how to rebuild stronger. Life can either break you down and you not be prepared, like this is going to happen either way, or you can think hard about life like this. You can work through these kinds of hard questions and be prepared to live life with strength, even though things might be falling apart around you. Ecclesiastes is trying to get us to think about life so that we don't end up completely broken down by life, but so that we see life with all its scattered pieces and we know how to rebuild with strength. And so that really takes us to part 2 here, which is the evidence for an afterlife. The evidence for an afterlife. I asked my kids this week, How do we know that God's real and that there actually is life after death? We talk about those kind of things at my dinner table. Before you're impressed by that, our conversation last night was also about their imaginary friend named Bob. So that's a whole other sermon for a whole other time. So it's not like we're always having these great conversations at my house. But their answer to how do we know there's an afterlife, their answer was, well, the Bible says so. And that's a good answer. It's a good answer. But it's incomplete. See, one of the unique things about Christianity is that we don't believe in an afterlife just because, a prophet or a holy man or even a holy book tells us so. No. The question at the end of chapter 3, when it says, who can bring him to see what will be after him? Friends, our answer to that is clear. Our answer to that is Jesus. Jesus can see what comes after us. Why? Because Jesus came to earth and went to death and came back. Like, we don't know what comes after us, but Jesus does. He has died, and he came back to prove that not only is there a God, he came back to prove that he is God. And that there is an afterlife. And he's made a way for us to be there with him forever. You see, the reason that we should believe in God and the reason that we should believe in eternity is because Jesus' tomb lies empty. That's the evidence that's been given to us for an afterlife. The fact that Jesus came back to life. Maybe you're thinking, well, there could be lots of explanations for, an empty tomb. Historically, how, people in Jesus' day tried to explain it. If you look at, some of the contemporary historians of that day, so the Jewish historian Josephus or the Roman historian Tacitus or Pliny the Younger, the common report historically was, well, the disciples stole Jesus' body so they could go and create a new religion. Now, what's interesting about that is it actually causes a problem for the theory that's actually going around today. There's a new theory that was made popular by, I'm thinking like Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion, or Christopher Hitchens in God's Not Great. They try to argue that the reason Jesus' tomb is empty is because his body was just somehow misplaced. Like, he wasn't actually buried in a tomb. Like, no one really knew where he was. His body was just kind of dumped somewhere. And then the disciples said, hey, he's risen, and no one could find his body. And so that's why it happened. But that doesn't make any sense to the historical data. And that's why those guys have been called out by people who aren't even Christians, but know a little bit of history. You see, if people said the disciples stole the body, then think about what that means. That means that it was very clear that there was a place that was well known where Jesus was, and one day it was empty. Right? Like, there's no reason to say the disciples stole the body if people weren't even asking the question, if the body had just been misplaced. Right? The reason they had to come up with a theory is because Jesus' tomb is empty. And so when it comes to thinking about whether Jesus did actually rise from the grave or not, what we really need to be thinking about is, what do the facts suggest about the disciples' likelihood to have stolen his body? Right? What do those facts suggest? It makes me think about the great Sherlock Holmes quote where, he says, and I wish I had a British accent to say this, but, just use your imagination. He says, my dear Watson, the problem is that you're trying to find facts to suit your theory instead of theories to suit your facts. Right? The facts, Watson, we always must start with the facts. And so let's just think about the facts. I mean, these are just indisputable historical facts. Fact number 1. All of Jesus' disciples abandoned him when he went to the cross. They didn't expect it to happen, and they didn't know what to do when it did. Fact number 2. Jesus' body went missing 3 days after he died. That's why they had to come up with an explanation for why it was no longer in the grave. Fact number 3. After Jesus' body went missing, all of a sudden, Jesus' disciples, who were afraid, started becoming very bold and openly acknowledging they were his disciples, and even stopping people in the street to say that Jesus had risen from the grave. And then fact number 4, the result of the disciples doing that is that they all suffered horrific fates for their testimony, right? Imprisonment and beating, exile, and for most, death. And so you have to ask yourself, does the theory that Jesus' disciples stole his body make sense of those facts? I don't see how it possibly could. And people, they'll die for things that they are mistaken about all the time. But think about it. If the disciples stole the body, it's not like they're making a mistake. Like, they would have known what they did. They would have known that Jesus is not really alive. And so when they're being torn away from their families, when they're being beaten and told they're going to be killed, like, all they would have to do is produce a body to go free. I mean, who continues to lie if all you're getting for that lie is a bunch of suffering? It makes me think of the quote from the great philosopher Blaise Pascal, who says very succinctly, "I believe witnesses who get their throats cut." So think about what this means, that if Jesus really has risen from the grave, then he has proven that there really is a God, that there really is an afterlife, because he died and then he came back to life. Like, Jesus shows us what comes after us. And he says that this isn't just something for him, but he says that we can have eternal life with him if we put our faith in him. And so this really shows us, this kind of evidence of Jesus and the afterlife, it shows us an answer, not just to the question of is there eternity or not, but also the question of how can God allow so much injustice to occur? How can God allow so much injustice to occur? Well, the answer that Jesus' resurrection gives is that not only is there a God, but also that God cares very much about justice. I mean, God is so committed to justice, so committed to not letting any wrongs go unpunished. He is so against turning a blind eye to oppression of any kind that he will unflinchingly bring death to anyone who abuses life. I mean, he's so committed to justice that the only way for us to go free from what we deserve for the wrongs we have done was for his son to come and take our place. The night before Jesus died, he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he asked God, is there any way, is there any other way than for me to have to die on this cross? The answer from heaven was silence, because there was no other way. Because God is committed to justice, even if that means his own son is going to have to face it. See, God's commitment to justice demands death. But the good news of the gospel is that his love dies that death in our place. See, on the cross, we see both the justice of God as God punishes sin, and we see the love of God as God takes that punishment upon himself. And so the justice of God and the love of God meet in a kiss of mercy at the cross of Jesus Christ. Jesus shows us that God's just, and he shows us that God is love. And so, yes, in this world there's oppression, and yes, in this world there is injustice, and in this world there's no sure promise of wrongs being put right. There are tears that won't be wiped away in this world. But we do not judge the character of God based upon what we see happening just in this world. Oh, there's injustice that happens now, but Jesus came to bring salvation by going to death and coming back again. Why? Because now is not all that there is. You see, when we ask the question, like, how can God allow this to happen? The problem is that we're asking it too soon. We're asking it too soon. I mean, if there's an eternity, then our life here isn't even the first paragraph of the first page of our actual story. Like, when we get to eternity, what we're going to realize is that this life on earth was but a brief experience of birth pains as we were delivered to our true and actual life. I love what Billy Graham shortly said before he died. He said, someday you'll hear that Billy Graham is dead. Don't believe a word of it. I shall be more alive then than I am right now. Right? He's recognizing the reality that this earth is not our only life. Like, this is just what we pass through in order to get to our real life, our eternal life with God forever. And when we get there, it makes me think about what C.S. Lewis said, the great author of Chronicles of Narnia. He said this as he talks about suffering. He said, they say of some temporal suffering that no future bliss can make up for it, not knowing that heaven, once attained, will work backwards and make even that agony into a glory. Right? He's saying that even sad things, like even those things, when we get to heaven, the worst thing that's ever happened to you, when you get to the other side, you're going to see God work in such a way that even that moment will be glorious. Friends, Jesus, sweet Jesus, has given us every reason to believe that we are not just beasts, that there is life after death, and a life that we can live with him forever. Jesus has given us all the evidence we should need that there's an afterlife and a way we can be with God in that for all eternity through faith in him. Which takes us to part number 3. What does this mean for us today? What does this mean for us today? If there's an eternity, and we're not just kind of animals who cease to be, friends, then here's one thing that means. That means that every life, every single human life, has unimaginable, unfathomable value and worth. See, while everything on this earth one day will pass away, everything on this earth will one day turn to dust, you have never met a person who's just going to turn to dust. You've never met one. C.S. Lewis says it this way: there are no ordinary people. You have never met a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilization, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. And so in light of this, ours must be real and costly love for our fellow human being. See, friends, everything is going to fade away. It is dust to dust for everything in this world. Compared to eternity, the most powerful nation on earth, nothing but a speck. But people last forever. You've never met a mere mortal. No, we all live with immortality. There is an afterlife that we will exist in forever, and therefore it is people who are the most valuable thing on this planet. You see, the author of Ecclesiastes, he was unsure to how to feel about injustice because he was unsure about eternity. But if we know that there's an eternity, if we know that people do extend beyond this life into the next, then we should absolutely care about justice right here now. We should absolutely care about alleviating suffering from these immortal souls. We should care about alleviating suffering in all its forms to the best of our possible ability. Because we know we're not just animals who live with, might makes right. That's not who we are. We're something more than that. And so if there is suffering, friends, it is our high honor to do whatever we can to show real and costly love to people in need. The homeless person who most don't even make eye contact with. The pregnant woman who is terrified to bring her baby into this world. The child who's been placed in the foster care system and forgotten about. The poor person in India who don't have the luxury of social distancing because if they don't go out, they won't eat that day. The orphan in Kenya who's been left to fend for themselves on the street with no help whatsoever. The children who are being trafficked in the streets of Cambodia. The women who are being exploited behind the lens of a camera every single day. The people in Thailand who are being held down by an oppressive regime. Friends, there is suffering and injustice all around us. And we can either behave like animals and not care about it as long as our bellies are full. Or we can rise up. And we can believe that there's no price you can put on someone who's been made for eternity. See, friends, believing that life does not end here on earth, this should make us committed to alleviating suffering and injustice as much as we can while we're here on earth. We should care about suffering. especially eternal suffering. See, if souls live forever, the only real question is, in what state will they live? Will they die in their sins and because of their rejection of God's love be under God's judgment? Or will they live in their salvation in Jesus and be welcomed to heaven through their faith in him? Listen, we can't control the decisions that anyone make about that. But we can do whatever we possibly can do to tell people about the decision that they must make. Like if people want to run away from God, we can't do anything to stop them. But we can throw our bodies in front of them and make them have to jump over us in order to get away from him. As I think about this, I think about, man, the opportunity that God is giving us right now to reach people. We're living in a moment of history where the gospel, this good news of Jesus, that he died our death, that he offers new life for anyone who has faith in him, this gospel message, it's never been more accessible than it is right now. I mean, you can share Jesus with your friends with a simple step of sending a link to this live stream. You can be part of the gospel going forward simply by liking or dropping a comment so that more people see them. I mean, Facebook algorithms right now are working on behalf of the gospel of Jesus Christ. As we get out daily devotionals, as we do things, and not just our church, there's every church, almost every church is getting out more gospel content online, more accessible than ever before. Friends, God is doing something, and it's incredible. This past week, in these past 3 weeks, I've personally known 20 people who have put their faith in Jesus Christ. God's on the move. God is on the move. And I want to be clear, I say that number not just to give a number. No, that's 20 souls who now are enjoying the security of a future with God forever, not because they learned how to be good people, but because they put their faith in Jesus Christ. Friends, it's incredible what God is doing, and it's amazing to me that he would want to use people like you to do it, and people like me. That God would want to use us. Isn't that just, it's mind-boggling to me. Who are we that God would want to use us? And yet God is using us. God is using you. The Lord is moving. And so my prayer for us has been that we would not just try to get through this season. My prayer is that we would embrace this season with a sense of purpose and vision for how God is on the move. There is eternity. Jesus has proven that to be true. And so the question really is, what are we going to do with that? And maybe you're watching this and maybe you've never really thought about eternity before. Friend, I want you to know today that if you place your faith in Jesus, I don't care what your background is. God doesn't care what your background is. It doesn't matter if this is the first sermon you've ever heard in your life. We're saved not by our spiritual resume. We're saved by what Jesus has done for us, what you heard today. That he died our death that we deserve on the cross. And he rose to new life. And if you put your faith in him, the Bible gives a promise that you will be saved. And so my question is, what are you waiting for? What are you waiting for? You are a prayer away from an eternal destination change. There's a number that's coming up on the screen. I would love to be able to pray for you. You can text in and just say, I want to believe in Jesus. Someone's going to reach out to you, pray for you. I believe God has you watching this because he loves you. And he doesn't want you to keep going through life without knowing his love. He wants you to come to know him and to embrace him. And it's a start of a journey. You don't have to have everything figured out at the start. You know, if you're waiting for things to figure out, you're going to wait it out too long. God just wants you to know the simple truth that he loves you, that he died for you, and you can be saved if you put your faith in him. Jesus said that his gospel was easy enough for the youngest child to understand. It's simple, friends. God is speaking this simple message to you. Would you believe in him? Would you place your faith in him? I've been praying that you would. I've been praying that you would. And for those of us who have, I think the question that we need to be thinking about is, what are we doing? What are we doing in this reality that there are eternal souls all around us? What are we doing to alleviate suffering? Like, how are we getting involved in caring for immortal souls. Like, if anything, it should be Christians who are on the front lines always of being people of action. People who take steps and do things, not because we're trying to be good people, but because we believe people have inestimable, value. We're not trying to do something just to get a good feeling about ourselves. No, we should do something because we care about the value and worth of immortal souls who have been created by God for a life to be lived with Him forever. And so, man, if you have yet to really get involved in something like that, we would love to connect with you. If you want more information about things we do as a church every single day to work against injustice in our city and to seek to alleviate the suffering, man, we would love to talk with you about that. Friends, we should care about suffering, especially eternal suffering. Who does God want you to share Jesus with? Who is the Lord placing on your heart right now? Who do you need to start praying for? How do you need to start praying for yourself to have boldness and courage to take a step to share with them? Who are you going to send this link to? Who are you going to send out tomorrow's daily devotional to? Who has God given you to reach with His eternal good news? Friends, life here is not fair. So what now? Well, here's what's now. Jesus promises there's a new life to come. And so let's live now in light of what we know is going to happen then. Let's live now in light of what we know is going to happen then. Let's bow our heads in prayer.